We called this session Knowledge is Power. We are talking today about the case for human rights due diligence to tackle corruption and human rights abuses in global supply chains. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sierra Leader. I'm a strategist and our human rights lead at the B Team, a nonprofit organization which is comprised of business and civil society leaders who seek to advance an inclusive and sustainable global economy. Our session today will dive into a topic that is key for social sustainability, considering the role and responsibility of governments and business in tackling corruption, as well as respect for human rights, and the case for conducting effective due diligence. We will examine how human rights due diligence processes can be a tool to discover and avoid corrupt practices and vice versa for existing anti-corruption processes to help prevent human rights abuses. This is a timely conversation as governments around the world are beginning to examine the potential for mandatory due diligence legislation for business, and as anti-corruption practitioners, all of you in this room can be advocates and conduits for broader understanding of how to tackle abuses using all methods possible. Human rights due diligence, both mandated and voluntary best practice, can help to mitigate and prevent risks such as forced labor, human trafficking, and environmental abuses under the newly recognized human right to a healthy environment, many cases of which are related to or overlap with cases of corrupt practices. This discussion will also reflect the urgency of uncovering historically opaque processes and partnerships and the risks that accompany them in order to improve the lives of people in vulnerable conditions. The case for conducting due diligence to avoid exposure to corrupt practices is strong, both in the supply chain and in the value chain of goods sold, services provided, and investments made. Due diligence is a critical step towards understanding and acting on companies' impacts, gaining fuller insight into the activities of business partners, suppliers, and customers, as well as aligning policies, practices, and investments with purpose. Tools that accompany, such as stakeholder engagement and continuous impact assessments, can also help to protect the most marginalized workers in supply chains, including women, refugees, and migrants. Societies and states writ large will also experience positive impacts through the benefits of an increasingly sustainable and stable economic environment. Both governments and businesses have a role to play in preventing and mitigating risks, including improving how they work together to tackle problems. Deeper collaboration for both an enabling regulatory environment and active engagement from business would support the achievement of the SDGs and provide a progressive realization of human rights. Civil society organizations, individual actors, and corruption fighters, such as rights defenders, must be supported in their efforts to eradicate corruption by promoting transparency and accountable governance. Governments and the private sector both have an interest in protecting civil society's ability to fight corruption. Our speakers today will be addressing the state of play in the overlaps of these topics and directions in which both human rights due diligence and anti-corruption efforts may develop. Our objective today is that you will all leave the session with ideas and tools to protect human rights and promote due diligence and transparency, and increased awareness of crossover solutions for reducing corruption and advancing human rights, as well as better understanding of steps already being taken by business and civil society leaders. Diverging slightly from the traditional panel format, after we hear initial remarks from our panelists and take some initial questions, we'll also open the floor to all of you to share your experiences in the field, to share ideas for effective tools and practices on both sides of human rights and anti-corruption efforts, and to present recommendations for simultaneously tackling human rights abuses and corrupt practices that can be enacted by governments, businesses, and civil society organizations. So I realize this is a lot to cover in 90 minutes, but we're going to do our best to make sure this is actually an engaging dialogue with a chance for everyone's voice to be heard. And I will apologize here that my jet lag is kicking in, so just be aware, but I'm sure we're all in very capable hands of our panelists. Without further ado, I will introduce them to you and then hand you over. So we are joined today by Professor Anita Ramasastry, who wears and has worn many hats, but who is today both Special Representative on Combating Corruption to the Chairperson-in-Office of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It's a mouthful. And the Henry M. Jackson Professor of Law at the University of Washington, directing the Sustainable International Development Law Graduate Program for the institution. Anita is also the immediate past chair of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights and holds advisory roles for the Institute of Human Rights in Business and the Irish Center for Human Rights. Also with us today is John Drimmer, who is a partner at Paul Hastings LLP, and among other roles, previously worked for Barrick Gold Corporation and the United States Department of Justice. John also holds advisory roles for the Global Business Initiative on Human Rights and the Secretariat of the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights Initiative, and is adjunct professor at the Georgetown University Law Center. Irit Tamir joins us today as the director of the Private Sector Department for Oxfam America. Irit is also adjunct faculty on business and human rights at the Boston College Law School. And last but not least, we have Dr. Henty Durker, who is the Chief ESG and Integrity Officer of SNC-Lavalin. Henty was previously Regional Compliance Officer of Canada for Siemens and is the past chair of the Board of Directors for the Ethics Centre of Canada. He currently participates in various anti-bribery and corruption working groups and think tanks and is passionate about promoting best practice sharing between organizations. So as you can tell, we have incredibly qualified experts with us today on both human rights and corruption, and I hope that you'll all be able to understand and experience with us today the intersection between these topics and why it is important to do so. So we'll start off with Anita to introduce us to a more in-depth crossover between the topics. Anita, the floor is yours.
I'll be actually brief, and I was going to say everything I know I learned from the person sitting next to me, Jonathan Drimmer, who I think is one of the people who really thinks about how you integrate business and human rights and anti-corruption into company policy and so forth. So whatever he says is right. No, I'm joking. But I, similarly to John, have had the opportunity to work in these two different fields, the field of anti-corruption and looking at how companies address corruption risk and challenges in markets, and then this new and emerging field, which some of you may know, but others of you may not know. Some people call it ESG, but it's not. There's a field which is called business and human rights, which is about this idea that companies need to use due diligence, not to think about risks to the company, but a process by which they understand the impacts of their operations on people. It's a concept that Professor John Ruggie, when he was a special representative to the Secretary General, used when he created something called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And these same principles and this framework have also found their way into the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and responsible business conduct more generally, and are now finding their way into laws in places like France, Germany, possibly the Netherlands, Norway, and a new directive that's being debated in the European Union, as well as guidelines on supply chains, even in places like Japan. So the idea and the challenge there is that what was a voluntary framework just about a decade ago, asking companies to benchmark their conduct against human rights, is now moving into from soft law to hard law. And so companies are now saying, okay, what does that mean for our world? Because traditionally, the human rights function in companies was often in the sustainability section or the CSR section or somewhere else, but that in the general counsel's office or the compliance team, you wouldn't necessarily have a human rights specialist. So one of the questions is that as we know corruption has an established, right, there's a regulatory system and people work in compliance, when we talk about companies needing to look at their supply chains and identify things like forced labor and other kinds of human rights risks, what does that now mean in a world where now it's regulatory? Before it was voluntary, even though there were standards and principles, et cetera. And when I say voluntary, I don't mean in a domestic context, but when we think about looking across jurisdictions, similar to foreign bribery. So when I spent 6 years on the working group in business and human rights, I was focusing on implementation of the guiding principles and working with government, civil society, and businesses, and Irit is one of my fellow travelers in that world, so she'll have a lot, I think, to say about due diligence in the human rights context. The question was, is there a relationship between these two, corruption and human rights risk, and what should that be? And I wrote a report in 2020, which was presented to the Human Rights Council on kind of connecting the dots, making these agendas more coherent. And I'll just give you one bigger observation, because others can speak more about sort of what we can do on the corruption side. There's just a question about, of course, as we look at compliance on the human rights side, what can we learn from the anti-corruption side? That's just a question, I think, for all of us. But the other piece is that when we talk about human rights due diligence, as I visited countries around the world wearing my UN hat, I encountered situations which were about business and human rights abuses relating to things like displacement of communities or people from land, for a project, issues of pollution in water relating to a particular factory, issues of dams collapsing and breaching, and issues of just state capture. So human rights abuses occurring in countries where companies and politicians were aligning their interests, but not in ways that favored the public, and so forth. In each of these, the key ingredient, the effect was human rights abuses, but one of the ingredients that led to those was corruption, right? That then the dam collapse, very often we find, and there's good research on this, right, that bribery was involved. Or if there was a failure to conduct an environmental impact assessment, it was because a bribe was paid. And if somebody was displaced from their land and land title was regularized, it was because a bribe was paid. So the connections are just there. And so one of the things that I realize is that when you're dealing with the human rights side of the equation, and companies engage in what's called stakeholder engagement, but they're meant to go out and ask people before they make decisions, how is this business activity affecting you, or might it affect you or your community? And in that stakeholder engagement, you very often, if you ask in the right way, will find out very specific information about where where the corruption issues are in a particular economy, at the big level, and also at that sort of more specific level, like regulatory. And that information should be going back into the compliance and corruption teams in companies, but isn't. So there's just a lot about the fact that you need to embed in the human rights due diligence process questions about corruption, because that stakeholder and rights holder engagement, which happens at the very operational level, is very important. And the information collected there should inform decisions relating to that market and to anti-corruption risk and sort of strategies around even things we're talking about here, like collective action. And a second piece is we can improve and learn from the corruption side on what we call business partner screening, right? We do that in the corruption context. You look at your agents, you look at your business partners, and you screen and you vet them based on corruption issues. We aren't quite there yet in terms of human rights risks, but that's another place where you can see integration, right? That over time, if we see that a local company or a security force or any kind of entity that you're going to contract with if you're a company has been implicated in a human rights abuse or violation, that should be a relevant issue as to whether you want to partner with them or whether corrective action at the front end is necessary before you go forward. So those are just two ideas of like how you connect these agendas.
Thanks, Anita. That was an excellent introduction and overview, and I hope that a lot of that will have made a lot of sense to most of you, even if you are typically only working on one side. I'm really glad that you were bringing up very, very important tools like stakeholder engagement, because there are on-the-ground tactics and techniques where this information may be very evident, and it's the responsibility of those of us working in the field to try and go and get that. I'm going to let John go ahead now. Thanks, John.
Sure. Thanks, and thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for sticking around. I want to talk a little bit about what I'm seeing in the business marketplace in terms of human rights and anti-corruption programs, and pick up a little bit on what Anita was talking about in terms of integration. And what we tend to see generally, and I am generalizing, is a spectrum. And on one end of the spectrum, you do have companies now that are increasingly seeing that they have human rights obligations, and they are treating them like issues that they do need to think about and address in a programmatic way. And so what they typically do is they give them to the compliance group, and they say, figure out how it is. We're going to avoid causing or contributing to or being directly linked to negative human rights impacts. And when that happens, often what we find is human rights issues and anti-corruption issues being included together within compliance frameworks. Now, often companies on this end of the spectrum lack human rights expertise, and so they are doing it and approaching it in a systematic way. But they don't really understand the human rights landscape so well, and often they'll be getting outside assistance. And there are advantages, clear advantages to trying this approach, this integrated approach, And among them are some of the points that Anita alluded to. Certainly, when you're doing anti-corruption training, you can include human rights elements. You can talk about human rights risks in the context of the anti-corruption training that you're doing. You can, as Anita talked about, include human rights indicators in your anti-corruption risk assessments. You can combine investigative resources when things ultimately go in a direction where you do need to look into it. So you can certainly look to leverage what you have on the anti-corruption side with a human rights program with this end of the spectrum. Though I do want to emphasize there are limits to the efficiencies. There's only so far you're really going to be able to go in trying to bolt on human rights to an anti-corruption program, and in part there are just going to be differences in the way diligence is done and how it's thought about, and grievance mechanisms versus hotlines. It's a different discipline, and it can't just be bolted on, but it isn't bad from a starting point. The other end of the spectrum is, with the growth of the business and human rights space, particularly since 2011 when the guiding principles were adopted, we've seen companies, particularly larger global companies, have dedicated human rights teams and human rights programs. And here you do have that internal expertise that you lack in the other model, but what you often then have is either a lack of a systematized approach, they aren't applying systems and processes to a human rights program, or they're siloed and they aren't really coordinating and communicating that effectively with the anti-corruption team, and you don't get those benefits in terms of efficiencies or in identifying the red flags, as Anita talked about, and I think Irit will talk about. They're fellow travelers. Human rights violations and corruption issues are fellow travelers, and a red flag. If you have a human health issue, there's a risk that you're going to pay off that inspector who comes out. And by the same token, if you pay off an inspector, you may be hiding a human health issue. So you do see corruption and human rights issues go hand in hand from a red flag standpoint, which is part of the efficiencies and what you want to look for in terms of training and diligence, et cetera. But I do think there are important ways to break down that siloization. And obviously we talk about due diligence, we talk about the trainings, we do talk about, and increasingly we're seeing joint committees that include various personnel to focus on human rights and sometimes anti-corruption related issues. So processes that exist internally ultimately to increase communication among compliance and human rights teams. So there are ways that can be done. But ultimately, I do think this is one of the places, and again, I want to be clear, like these are two ends of the spectrum, there are lots of points in between. But I do think this is one of the places where regulation, some of the regulations that Anita referenced, can be particularly helpful. And so when we look at the mandatory human rights due diligence movement in the EU, and particularly the draft directive that the EU itself is considering, corruption was considered, and it was included as a governance component in the original report about the directive. And it was taken out, and there's talk about maybe it should go back in. But I do think including corruption along with human rights, which is with environment the primary focus of the directive, will compel companies to think about these together, and will compel companies to ultimately develop processes and communicate around how they're addressing these very related risks. And so the final point, though, I do want to make that does represent something of a difference in these fields, and Anita certainly alluded to it in the context of stakeholder engagement externally. I want to talk a little bit about it internally. And so on the corruption side, on the anti-corruption side, when you're doing anti-corruption training, for me, when I was in-house, I often found it hard to kind of connect the subject matter with the audience. You flip through your deck, you talk about the elements, of an anti-corruption violation, and you show cases and stuff like that, and people just kind of stare at you and blink. And the big difference was when I actually started including local employees in presenting the training. As Anita said, everybody understands where corruption is in their local communities, and everybody is deeply and personally affected and troubled by it. And when they start talking about their personal experiences with corruption and what programs are ultimately designed to prevent and avoid contributing to the social ills that it brings, it has an enormous impact when you think about internal audiences. And so I would say one of the challenges with having anti-corruption and human rights go together is that human rights really looks at impacts on third parties. Corruption really looks at impacts on the business, but I do think those can be effectively bridged, particularly when you're thinking about where these impacts happen, which is on the ground in local communities. And so looking for additional ways to fuse them in company programs, I think, in addition to regulation, is going to be an effective way to make sure that the benefits of the different points on the spectrum really do come together.
Thank you, John. So many good points in these very brief remarks already. Hearing the importance of trainings on indicators for both sides. I think you made an excellent point that we wouldn't want to lose expertise from either human rights or anti-corruption teams, but I think a deepened understanding for both sides of the other side will help to, recognize those red flags. Internal stakeholder engagement as well, very, very good point. And I think that these are things that would also apply not just in a business, but if we think about even, government, public procurement processes, that this is advice that's applicable to all parties. I'm going to hand over to Irit now to talk us through a little bit from the civil society side.
Great, and thank you so much for having me. As Anita and Jonathan have already sort of pointed out, clearly there is a very strong link between corruption and human rights violations. Systemic corruption often impedes individual enjoyment of many of the most fundamental human rights, whether it's the right to life or the right to a livelihood. And human rights violations create the type of chaos and conflict that serve as fertile ground for corrupt acts. So they go hand in hand many, many times. They also share common root causes. Things like instability and weak political institutions and poverty can present similar indicators and can be mutually reinforcing for both human rights violations and for corruption. Corrupt practices by companies can also exacerbate human rights issues and even lead directly to a violation of human rights. Companies may pay their way out of meeting, for example, local environmental or labor standards, resulting then in human rights harms to impacted communities. Take an instance where, for example, a company might bribe local officials to get out of having to pay a building permit for a new facility. The facility's not built to code, and then years later collapses with workers inside. We've seen those scenarios, right? Companies can co-opt state security forces by buying them off and enlisting them in rights violations or an abuse of judicial process against local human rights defenders. So these are ways in which corruption is then directly leading into human rights violations. And the root causes are crucial to both issue areas. And we believe human rights due diligence can be one element in understanding those root causes and then trying to address them. A robust human rights due diligence process entails examining and shining a light on the practices taking place in supply chains, as well as meaningfully engaging with rights holders and worker communities. So as both speakers before have alluded to, you are really engaging those people that are affected both by the corruption and potentially by the human rights violations. These efforts enhance both transparency and traceability, and in so doing can augment efforts to combat both corruption and human rights violations. They also help to surface the root causes that companies need to address as part of their due diligence process where they can. So let's look at some specific areas or examples of where we often see corruption and human rights violations go hand in hand. Let's take the case, for example, of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing in this context. With major aspects of production taking place far from land and from the control of national authorities, coupled with highly concentrated points of interaction with local officials at ports of entry, The fishing sector presents great vulnerabilities for corruption to take root and facilitate the kind of rights and law violations that many of you have probably heard of taking place on the high seas, from human trafficking to environmental violations. Perhaps in part because of the opaque nature of this industry, we actually see some fairly robust traceability requirements imposed on some fishing fleets, like the Seafood Monitoring and Import Program in the US. It's these kinds of mechanisms that can be proof points for other traceability efforts in human rights due diligence for other sectors and can potentially serve to deter corrupt acts as well. In the oil, gas, and mining sectors, for so long notorious for corruption and opacity, we've seen great progress in broadening the scope of transparency around extraction. Disclosure of payments to governments, contracts, and beneficial ownership, and transparency around state-owned companies and commodity trading have increasingly become global norms. But it hasn't yet been enough to fully thwart corruption, and the sector remains plagued, unfortunately, by an inability to hold corporate actors meaningfully accountable. It's also an area where we see a lot of human rights violations. Take the case of Glencore, for example, which admitted to the Department of Justice to paying more than $100 million to third-party intermediaries to bribe public officials to obtain and maintain lucrative mining and training deals. While the settlement terms have largely amounted to a slap on the wrist for the company, which had over $200 billion in revenues just in 2021, and it hasn't been enough to get investors or downstream supply chain actors to fully address the issue. So as the demand for transition materials begins to skyrocket, governments and the private sector are pushing for fast tracking of projects in a way that threatens environmental and social safeguards, puts human rights at risk, and exacerbates corruption risks as well. Historically, commodity booms have led to a rush on this kind of deal-making, which can often create incentives for corruption. We need extractive companies to adopt risk mitigation measures regarding agents, state-owned enterprises, and politically exposed persons, and invest in effective whistleblower mechanisms. Downstream supply chain actors need to play a role here as well, including by pushing for greater transparency and stronger anti-corruption legislation and legislation, including things like mandatory human rights due diligence. I'd like to turn now to the issue of land grabs, where we also see strong overlap between land grabs and corruption. This often occurs at times when governments in commodity sourcing countries are often responsible for allocating land to the private sector for investments. This is where we can often see governments handing out land to companies without the consent or engagement of the people who are already there. Small farming communities who rely on the land for their livelihoods, housing, source of water, grazing. This is often a right place for corruption. When the people handing out the land or benefiting most from the exchange are not the same people who will be most affected by the land acquisition or land use change, this is a high risk for corrupt practices and human rights violations. And indeed, in countries where corruption is known to be high, we often see high levels of land grabbing. Corruption in land acquisitions can take many forms. For example, corrupt investors may be outright paying bribes to public officials in exchange for favorable land acquisitions, or paying bribes or making promises to decision makers within a community, like traditional leaders, who may not be acting on the interest for all. And again, this is when those local stakeholders will know exactly where the corruption is sitting most times. One example of this was in the Philippines, where we saw in the mining sector, even though the national law required free, prior, and informed consent of communities, it was found in practice that the process was just a rubber stamp because project proponents were buying off leaders and causing division of communities. To be sure, well-meaning companies may not even know they are grabbing land or violating people's rights, thinking they are going through appropriate legal channels. But companies need to take additional steps to ensure respect for rights and to mitigate against the risk of these corrupt practices, and potentially doing so through human rights due diligence. What FPIC does is, free, prior, and informed consent, does is ensure that people who will be affected are informed about potential land acquisition or land use change before the project occurs, and then they can typically negotiate to either have the project not take place or to actually get benefits from the project. In short, what we see here is that human rights due diligence is a tool that is necessary for identifying human rights risks, but it's also beneficial in identifying corrupt practices as well, as these two are often interconnected.
Thank you so much, Irit. I mean, if that wasn't illustrative, I don't know what would be. I think it's very clear how often these abuses and risks occur in the same space. Some of these that you mentioned, I mean, I think people in this room are probably working directly on some of these topics, so thank you for that. Thank you also for raising, again, stakeholder engagement. You know, I think this is a recurring trend, and I think for those of you who were in plenary earlier today, I'm in the Defenders plenary, this is just one more connection to understanding people who are standing up against these abuses, against these corrupt practices. They also need that protection, and they need to be involved in the processes of discovering them, because they often have this information which isn't making its way up to the higher levels. I'm going to hand over to Henty to wrap up our initial remarks. Please go ahead.
Super, thanks. And just a disclaimer, I'm by no means a human rights expert like my esteemed panel next to me, but I can, comment on, as a company, as a global organization, how we think about it, how we've implemented it, what lessons have we learned over the years, and maybe there's some valuable information for you from that perspective. So a little bit from our company perspective, we're a global engineering services company. Approximately 35,000 employees. A couple of years ago, we were about 50,000 employees, and we were active in the oil and gas industry, who had quite a big footprint in the Middle East. And this was an acquisition that we did back in 2014, and I think that's kind of where the company's human rights journey started, was realizing that, we made this acquisition. We've got quite a large labor force that's made up of migrant labor from Philippines, from Nepal, from India, that's working for us in the Middle East. And really trying to make sure that we understand, how that works and how the due diligence works around that. And I'll talk a little bit about the lessons learned in just in a short while. I think from a company perspective, I joined in 2015, and we realized that we're not sure where human rights was sitting. Was it HR? Because they say it's recruitment, we're recruiting people. Others were saying, no, it's with procurement, because procurement is procuring labor brokers, and they're getting the labor in. So there wasn't clear ownership. So I think the first thing from a company perspective is really to make sure who's accountable for your human rights aspects at your company. So I put my hand up, and at that point I was the Chief Compliance Officer of the company. I'm currently the Chief ESG and Integrity Officer. Integrity Compliance, same thing, just rebranded because it makes a lot more sense. And we said we want to take it on, because it's really important for us to make sure that whatever we do from a human rights perspective, that we've got the same type of controls around that than what we have from an anti-corruption, bribery, anti-competition, antitrust, and all those types of things in place. So one of the first areas, I think, where we decided to expand, and even now with ESG and from a sustainability perspective, it's no longer just good enough to do due diligence on your suppliers, your vendors, or even your clients, and just look at it from a anti-corruption red flag perspective or news. You need to look at it from a completely broad spectrum that includes human rights, that includes safety issues, that includes environmental issues, tax issues, because that kind of gives you a clue in terms of how serious your client, which would be reputational if you work for them, or your suppliers, who you can choose if you want to work for them or not, how strongly they take these types of topics. So adjusting your systems to not work in silos, but actually working expanded across all these topic areas when you do your due diligence, or when you do your supply qualification processes, or when you are busy with project bidding, and when the project bids go to management, that there is a discussion to talk about flags from a client perspective, because it's all about reputation. And I can tell you, it's, from a consulting perspective, reputation, brand is everything. And you can lose it just like that, and it takes years and years to kind of bring back, and sometimes you can't. So I think from a company perspective, really, really important that you look at that. It needs to be part of the risk management process, because the risk management process also really dictates where gaps, where mitigations, where controls, or where processes needs to be adapted. So think about it from a risk management process. There needs to be proper contractual language within your agreements, within your supplier code of conduct, and really making sure that on top of having that from a contractual perspective is to actually go out and do audits on your suppliers. And as part of my lessons learned, typically from a recruitment perspective, is we really had issues with our labor brokers, and really going to the labor brokers and auditing them, and in some cases either blacklisting them or working with them to improve. But you need to be with them. You need to be on the ground, because it's not a paper exercise that you can do. And then I think, really making sure that employees, and especially the most vulnerable employees, if you have laborers, migrant laborers working for you, is to feel safe to talk or to speak up. Making sure that you've got speak up posters in different languages, very simple languages, so that they, or even pictograms. We actually had pictograms for our blue collar workers in the Middle East, to make it easy for them to see, oh, SNC-Lavalin does no fee recruitment. Why did I have to pay $500 or $1,000, when the recruiter came to me to offer me a job? Because that shouldn't have happened. And then being able to stick up their hands and say, I had to pay money, and then allowing us to kind of investigate that and take actions accordingly. So really focusing on that psychological safe environment for your employees. Also very important is, as a company, if you get engaged with joint venture partners, making sure that you put, we always put an integrity program handbook together. They do the same from a health and safety perspective, so that when a project starts and you've got partners in that project, that everybody kind of understands which whistleblowing line are you going to use, whose health and safety codes are you going to use, or policies are you going to use, how are we going to communicate that. So really making sure that you've got those things in place, that there's clear responsibility. And it's a couple of lessons learned, and then I'll hand it back over. Is I talked about our most vulnerable people, from that came over, and they had to pay fees, and we investigated that. Making sure when you do have laborers who lives in housing, on projects, making sure that there's adequate, oversight over that, especially if it's under your control, and making sure that is according to standards from a living perspective. And then not forgetting that it's not only in the high-risk countries where you potentially have these issues. It could be closer to home as well. And we're a Canadian-based company, and we in a recent project where we're a joint venture with another company, there was a concern raised about some of the products that was being used in a project in Canada that came from forced labor in China, and it made headline news, and it was a wake-up call for us, because it wasn't under our supervision, but it was with our partner. So it kind of reflects back to the joint venture that you engaged with, and we subsequently engaged with our joint venture partner to understand, how much due diligence did they do in terms of understanding where this product came from. And they were able to show that they did due diligence, and I think we discussed, how much due diligence can you really do. But I think it's just, from my perspective, it's kind of a wake-up call that you have to be, you can apply regionally human rights processes, But you have to always consider that it could happen, in a country like Canada as well. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks so much, Hunty. I'm very glad to hear you reflecting again, as John did, the need to break down silos within companies. Very important that people are talking to each other on these different topics. Very much appreciate your points about oversight and supervision as well, understanding that even if it was not originating from your own operations, that working closely with partners to make sure you know what's going on is very important. And I actually have a quick question for you. I realize a little impromptu, but I wanted to know, based on what you mentioned around, deciding not to work with a supplier, to stop working with a supplier, do you have a sort of programmatic set of indicators, or how would you usually go about that process?
Yeah, so typically we call it a reference list that we have, and as we do investigations, we've got our own internal compliance investigations team. So if we get any allegations that come in that's either related to bribery, corruption, fraud, in this case it was human rights, kind of abuses, we do investigations. We compile reports, and it gets submitted to a committee which we call our Ethics and Compliance Committee, who then reviews these reports and then determines the recommendations or the outcomes from these reports. And if a case is substantiated and where a supplier might have been involved in nefarious activities, we would then make a recommendation to put them onto our reference list. And what that entails then is that reference list is actually integrated into our due diligence system or program, so that when we do our supply qualification processes or we check on clients, if it's on our internal reference list, it will come up as a flag, which the procurement or whoever's busy with that project would then come back to our department to find out, why is there a flag on there? Can we work with them, yes or no? And sometimes it's a hard no, and sometimes it's a this happened 4 or 5 years ago. Let's go and re-engage with them, see if they've made improvements, and if they have, then we can kind of reconsider it. But we've got a whole kind of process around that.
Thank you for that. That's very interesting to hear about, actually, and good to know that, well, I suppose there's many questions about, making sure that we can actually help suppliers, smaller companies, to develop better practices instead of just saying, no, we won't work with them. So appreciate you being able to explain that. I wanted to take this opportunity to open the floor for our first round of questions. If there's anyone who wants to start asking, I think we have a mic up here at the front, actually. If you want to perhaps stand up and walk to this microphone that's at the front of the room, by all means, please come on down, and we'll do a first round of questions from these remarks. If you could please introduce yourself before you ask.
All right. Thank you very much. My name is Simon Gauss. I'm with the Alliance for Integrity. We are a multi-stakeholder collective action focused on integrity in the private sector. And we're working a lot on this topic, so I'm really glad about this panel. And I just want to emphasize also that I think the topic of integrating human rights, compliance, and anti-corruption is important, in particular from the perspective of smaller suppliers, right? Because what otherwise happens is they get a lot of pressure, a lot of different documents, a lot of due diligence, different contexts in the company. So it's not just a matter, I would say, of synergies and of being efficient. It's also a matter of leveling the playing field as much as possible between smaller SMEs and larger suppliers in the Global South, for example. Right? So that's just one thing I wanted to emphasize. And the question I have is related to one topic you just mentioned, namely that traditionally, I would say in compliance, it's especially anti-corruption, it's sometimes quite trigger-happy, right, and quite punitive. So internally, if it's within a company, the response for a serious violation is termination of the contract. In response to business partners, it's termination of the business relationship, if it's serious. Right? Whereas the very idea behind the human rights legislation now is exactly that, supporting your supplier to get better. Right? And there's this talking about zero tolerance. Strictly speaking, zero tolerance is not the idea of current human rights legislation. And so I'm wondering what you think about how this fits together. If that is really a difference that will continue to stay like this, or maybe even we should, in our anti-corruption work, also move towards this idea of being supportive rather than being punitive. Thanks.
Does any of you feel motivated to take that? Otherwise, I'll call on someone.
I think it's a great question, actually. And at least around human rights due diligence, we often say to companies, we do not want to see you cut and run. That you should really not disengage from the supplier unless you really think the supplier is just not willing to change and isn't willing to work with you towards respecting human rights. But you bring up a good point. What then do you do if there's corruption? And I think we have to make a distinction, right? Because while these two issues are often interrelated, the same actor may not be the one committing both, right? So it might be that the supplier, acquired land from a third party. That third party was the one that was, the corrupt party, right? But now this supplier has tainted land, so to speak. So what do they do about that? So I do think you need to make a distinction about where the impact is and where the act is. And for me, they're not the same. And so therefore, the conduct for how you approach them, I think, could be quite different.
So I'll pick up where Irit left off. And so you've got a supplier, and you have human rights risks, you've got anti-corruption risks. And obviously, the UN Guiding Principles and the draft legislation and the adopted legislation, it all talks about mitigating your human rights risks, and if you can't sufficiently mitigate them, only at that point do you think about ending the relationship, and balance that against the human rights impacts associated with terminating the relationship. But on the other side, the Department of Justice in the United States is going to have very little sympathy if you basically say, well, we did all of this because of the human rights side, and yeah, there was bribery afterwards because there was still a corruption risk. And so I do think you have to be quite mindful of the regulatory risks, but at the end of the day, on the anti-corruption side, anti-corruption controls are all about mitigating risks associated with high-risk third parties. And number one, when you approach it from an anti-corruption standpoint, one question is always, does this really have the potential to get you into legal trouble, right? I mean, is this something that is corruption in an abstract sense, or is this corruption in the sense that you may be liable for it, number one? Number two is, just as you would do on the human rights side, try to mitigate the relevant corruption risks. And if you feel like they can be sufficiently mitigated to a point where it is reasonable for you to go forward, and this is a valued relationship for a number of reasons, then you ought to consider it. But no question that there is potential tension there, and obviously mitigating human rights risks, but not paying sufficient attention to mitigating the corruption risks really may land you into real hot water.
And I'll just add one little piece in terms of, as we're talking about what's kind of different about the risks, which is that in some situations, the human rights impact that you're trying to correct isn't an illegal activity, right? That the whole idea of business and human rights is that, it might be discrimination against LGBTQ people in one market, or gender discrimination, is that you're trying to create for the business, right, this sort of common standard using human rights. So I think that is one key distinction why this concept of using leverage and mitigation works in the human rights model. But if you have illegal conduct in the human rights space, then it's going to be, I think, a different equation, right, in terms of what you're going to do. Although, again, you might still try to use mitigation measures.
Thank you. I hope that at least gave a little bit of answer to your question. I saw a couple of other hands. Please go ahead and come up to the microphone. And remember to introduce yourself, please.
Hi there, Andrea Rocca from Transparency International Secretariat. I'd like to ask a question building on your comment as moderator and the reference to the session this morning, defending the defenders. And of course, defenders can be targeted by non-state actors and corporations as well. Now, there is a fundamental difference, though, between the human rights impact of business operations and the targeting of those exposing corruption or other human rights issues, and there is degree of intentionality. You're really going after those people actively threatening, intimidating, and whatever other way through legal means. So does the same approach really work of tackling human rights impact of business operations and this quite different subset of instances, as in the targeting of defenders, or do we need to see something different in initiatives like the draft EU directive? What do we need to see there for the draft directive, for example, to really be effective in tackling the targeting of anti-corruption activists and other defenders?
I'm actually going to let Anita take this question as she's an expert on defenders.
I'm not an expert, but the working group on business and human rights put out guidance a year ago focusing on how the UN guiding principles relate to the issue of respect for human rights defenders. So guidance for governments, guidance for business, and issues and for civil society. So I think there are two pieces, and I think John or maybe Irit mentioned, or both of them. The first one is that defenders themselves are crucial to identifying human rights risk and red flags, right? So that piece of engagement with them and seeing them as people who are critical to success of your business operations, as well as to protecting them and their communities or whoever they're representing, is essential. So that's one thing. But the second piece is that what we're seeing in many situations, now if a company is directly, right, causing the harm to the defender, there's two pieces, right? One is that may already be bringing us into criminal activity and so forth. So that's not the situation where I think most of the business and human rights dilemmas lie for the larger companies, right? That in the situation where we're talking about a headquartered company that's located somewhere else, but the defender is still being is still at risk because of operations on the ground, very often similar to corruption, right? It's a third party, so it might be a local security service, or it might be a business affiliate, or it might be actually a local authority that is the one that wants to make the problem go away. So the guiding principles speak about that as a situation of linkage, right? So in those situations, the company needs to identify in advance what the risks to the defender community is, right? So that if you're going to operate, you're going to open a mine, or you're going to be sourcing from a particular area, you need to anticipate through using human rights impacts who the defenders are, and actually identify the specific risks, which are potentially loss of life, right, to those defenders, and take steps to mitigate, right? Because there are all of these other partners, government and security and business and other companies that are in your ecosystem to prevent the harm, right? So I think that, I agree there are limitations, but I think that the prevention aspect of the guiding principles, if you actually ask about the specific risks to defenders, and then when we talk about providing remedy, you then need to think about, because there's the heightened risk, what are the protocols and programs you need in place to address these issues? So there's a variety of things. But I mean, again, if you have thoughts about sort of, are the guiding principles fit for purpose, I think they are when a company is especially linked to the risk to defender, right? Not the direct perpetrator of the harm. Your thoughts, John? Or you read?
I just wanted to say we had a particular experience of a situation where it was a multinational company sourcing from a national company. In this case, it was in Guatemala, and they were, threatening the human rights defender in this particular situation. The multinational companies, there were more than one, came in and actually started engaging the supplier and saying that this was not in accordance with the guiding principles. And by using their leverage, they actually were able to get this company not only to stop, but to actually employ a policy around human rights defenders to the point now where they're the leader in the country with respect to this commodity and treating human rights defenders. Because to some degree, these are not, the norms are not accessible to all companies around the world, right? And sometimes suppliers need to be educated around what the right approach is. And so this was a good example of where leverage was used to really change the behavior of the supplier.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in exactly the same place. I actually do think that the legislation that we're seeing, I think the frameworks that we are seeing are broad enough to allow for protections of human rights defenders, whether it's cause, contribute, or directly linked. The challenge is, as both Anita and Irit talked about, is making sure that's understood how to do that. I think that it does require some particular specialized understanding and explanation in a way that often isn't given. So I do think the frameworks are broad enough, but I don't know that there's wide understanding about how to use the frameworks in a way that do provide protections for human rights defenders in the multiplicity of ways that there can be, attacks. And whether it's slap suits to physical violence, that's part of the challenge as well, is, what is an attack and how do you think about addressing it? So I think the frameworks are sufficiently broad, but more explanation and guidance is needed.
Thank you, all three of you. I see other hands. Yeah, if you guys want to come up to the microphone when you're ready.
I'm far too short. Rebecca Lee of Open Corporates, but my previous life I was a forensic investigator. My question is kind of two parts, really, and it's the role of enabling data to be made available by companies in your supply chain all the way through. I'd love to hear the panel's thoughts on requiring companies that suppliers are working with in your supply chain, either to produce data publicly or reporting around their ESG credentials, etc., even if they're not required to in their local country, and the role that might play in being able to allow companies to do kind of due diligence, knowledge is power, for example. And then secondly, the kind of role of organisations, like I'm really quite excited by Open Apparel becoming Open Supply Hub and their extension there, WikiRate and others that are pulling together kind of all of this different reporting. Do you think that might become a disruptor in allowing us actually to fulfil our responsibilities in due diligence around human rights and corruption and slavery, etc.?
Anyone want to start?
I can maybe start. I think it's a great idea, because as a company, you struggle in getting all the data, and I think as vendor management systems, supply qualification processes, just the way of how we think of what metrics we want from our suppliers in order to be able to do all the ESG kind of reporting. It will be really beneficial, and I don't think there's as a company, if you want to work with suppliers that value the same values as what you value. So really digging into exactly what you're expecting from them, I think is really important, and it's up to the companies to put that in place. It's just my personal.
John, I see you reaching for the microphone.
I think one of the big challenges with suppliers, particularly when you get beyond the first tier, is not only access to information, as Henty's talking about, but I think from the suppliers, a lot of them are feeling, like they're having an onslaught of due diligence questionnaires, and you hear it time and time again. You have very similar overlapping questionnaires, and they have to fill them out one after another, after another, after another. And not only is it burdensome and difficult, but you end up then getting more cursory information because they have to fill out so many. So I do think coming up with common schemes around transparency to identify key issues from a human rights standpoint, from an anti-corruption standpoint, responsible business conduct more generally, is a great idea. And I know folks have thought about different collective action approaches in terms of due diligence with suppliers and sub-suppliers, but transparency, I think, would be a really good initiative to pursue as well.
Next, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Ekaterina Lisova, and I'm from CIPE, Center for International Private Enterprise. And so the way we work, we partner with local private sector around the world. And so through business associations or Chamber of Commerce or other business think tanks. And so what we see is that many small and medium-sized companies that are in the supply chains, they do have contractual clauses, but they do not understand them. And they cannot be in compliance with that. And we do all understand that within anti-corruption compliance programming, those large companies that have to conduct training in local languages in person. I mean, we do all these wonderful rules, but they do not always work, and it's not how the companies operate. So when we approach companies and we say, so what have you changed since you started working in the supply chain? They say, well, actually nothing. Are you aware of the clause? Yes, but I do not understand what that means. So my question is, how do you see changing that, not just from the individual company, the large company's perspective when they do conduct some training, but if they don't, or they do not do enough of that, how to engage those local companies and the communities, bringing them together. And that's what we are trying to do, using our capacity to bring them together, to organize them some collective action type of meetings so they can share experiences. And what is missing currently is that those large companies kind of supporting or backing up those locally organized attempts to do the right thing. Do understand, put the meaning into those clauses. So how do you see the prospect for that? We haven't started piloting it yet, but how do you see companies engaging and supporting those local drive for better compliance, better understanding, those things? Thank you.
So I'll give 3 quick examples, and I'm sure my colleagues have many. On the anti-corruption side, when I've seen in sectors where there is strong collaboration between larger companies and SMEs, so things like pharmaceuticals, medical devices, co-creation of codes of conduct where you're not just training, but you're actually working with the SMEs from your regional partners to develop something that's going to work, so taking the larger expectations and scaling them down, I think has been successful. And there are people at the conference here who've talked about sort of the APEC business ethics model for SMEs. In the business and human rights side, I'd say 2 things. One is that there's going to be a lot of money coming out of donors, so places like the European Union, Germany, elsewhere. In their own countries, they're creating SME help desks, right? So for German companies, for example, there's going to be an SME help desk in the UK where SMEs can go and seek the guidance to sort of figure out. But for their partners, there's going to be partner-to-partner cooperation, right? So businesses that are sort of working with one another across markets will benefit from this technical assistance. But as you're mentioning SIPE, so your own organization, another model is that the International Organization of Employers, right, which deals with SMEs and has a global footprint, is now going to create a center of excellence, which is really going to be focusing on moving capacity building to that local level. So I think there'll be a lot of solutions that are going to be tailor-made to reach that last mile.
And maybe from my side, I think if you work with the SMEs, find out who their big clients are and approach them. Because I think any big multinational organization, would welcome, that kind of focus on SMEs where they operate in, because it creates a better playing field for everybody. So as a multinational, I think we always try to strive in the regions where we operate. What initiatives, what collective actions are going on that we can kind of tap into. For example, Alliance for Integrity. We involved there with Latin America with one of my integrity officers, and it's personal development for her. But it's also, vested for us because we kind of, helping the SMEs, from a training perspective and that type of thing. So for sure, I think if you advertise it and make sure that the big multinationals is aware of it, I think you'll be surprised about the buy-in.
I guess just to jump in, and kind of bridge Hanti's and Anita's comments, I am increasingly seeing companies apply systematized, responsible supply chain programs. And I think we are starting to see emerging best practice come out of it that hopefully will trickle down throughout the market. But it typically involves starting at the RFP phase, the initial phase of engagement, where you start by setting your relevant expectations for responsible conduct even before bids are entered or contracts are entered into, and then it moves to the contracting phase and the onboarding phase. But then thereafter, programs will also include ongoing engagement, and that engagement can occur in different ways. It can occur through regional meetings and town halls, or even just blast emails or newsletters. Annual supplier summits is something that I'm starting to see more of. And then obviously post-engagement monitoring and making sure that, auditing and folks are abiding by the relevant standards, and then re-upping the relevant due diligence. So I am starting to see much more sophisticated, responsible supply chain programs from leading companies. And so I do think that is something that we ought to watch for in terms of trickling down through the market.
And I would just add one other thought to this, which is that a lot of the issues oftentimes is not enough investment from the country itself, right? Especially when we're talking about agriculture or, where there's a particular commodity that the country is really exporting. And so getting the multinational company actually to engage government too, to help with giving that investment, the infrastructure that the small businesses actually need to thrive and be able to comply, is also another thing that I think companies can do to help sort of level the playing field for them.
Thank you all for that. Were there any more questions just now from the audience? And to our AV team in the back, if there's any that come in online, please let me know how we can tackle those as well. If not, I want to transition us a little bit into the less traditional aspect of this session today, which I warned you a little bit about at the beginning. And what I want to do now is not open the floor for questions, but to open the floor for suggestions, for recommendations. If anyone would like to experience share, what we're looking for here is, as practitioners across a number of different fields in this room, what do you think business could be doing? What do you think governments could be doing to enable that environment? And how can civil society be supporting both processes? So if anyone would like to put their hand up, come up to the microphone, we'd like to really hear those thoughts from you today. Since no one is running forwards, I can just reflect, we have heard a few already throughout the conversation. Some innovation ideas, common industry schemes for transparency, capacity building for suppliers, for SMEs, even annual supplier summits we just heard about. These certainly would cover both fields, human rights and anti-corruption. But from each of your work, is there any other idea coming from the floor? Yes, please.
Sorry, yeah, just to mention, the one thing that helps us to promote this work is, of course, incentives. Usually the small companies, they say, we need incentives because you'll be penalized for actually complying, because there are so many of those who do not comply. So how we can be recognized for doing the right thing. So therefore, we're, through advocacy, that's what we're supporting them with. Go to the government, talk to the government, find the ways to be recognized for good behavior, not for bad, such as including certain things into the procurement systems, for example, where whether you have an effective, meaning actual functioning compliance program, then you probably, all things equal, you might get a contract and, or, by some breaks on taxation, whatever, any other things that would allow you to even just jumpstart this. I'm talking about countries with systemic corruption, where compliance is not a thing. So that helps. And so they won't want to see this from the government, some signs that we would support you.
Thank you for that. I wanted to actually ask maybe Irit, as our primary civil society representative, what would you like to be seeing from governments and from business?
It's a really great question. Obviously, we are very much advocating for human rights due diligence, both in the EU, but frankly, we'd love to see it also in the US, where the US obviously has so many large multinational corporations with a global footprint that human rights due diligence would really make a tremendous impact by getting companies to do that here. But in addition to that, I do think that in the specific countries that we're talking about where we see these challenges, we do need to think about what those root causes are, and not just the actual acts, but what's causing corruption to be in place, what's causing the human rights violations to begin with, and oftentimes it is these weak institutions. It is companies that have so much power that they literally dominate the negotiations with countries. And so how do you level the playing field in a way to give countries more of a say as to how their own economy is going to be run? And so we really need to sort of, rebalance that system to some degree, and really encourage governments to invest in local economies and not just these global economies.
Thanks for that. Switching up a little, Henty, maybe you could talk about what you would like to see from governments, from the business side.
Putting me on the spot there. No, I think, with my ESG hat on, I think we're in such a position at the moment. There's so much focus on ESG reporting, putting standards and reporting frameworks in place. ISSB is working on something. The European EFRAG has got something in place. There's definitely a convergence in terms of what is going to be expected from companies to report on. So maybe not government, but more from a regulatory, not even from a regulatory, but from a reporting perspective. Is I think, and I mentioned in the previous panel as well, as we've got the unique opportunity to kind of guide and support and give feedback into the setting of these standards and reporting frameworks, to get what we want companies to report on in there. So it's really up to all of us to kind of jump on the bandwagon, jump on the wave, and really try and get all the different aspects that makes a company a sustainable company and how they operate wherever they operate across all the various areas within their business, to make sure that they are being held accountable in terms of how they operate, and being held accountable meaning talking publicly about things.
Thank you for that. John, reaching for the microphone.
Let me just talk for a second about what I am seeing, and whether I want it to or not, this is what I am seeing, and that is, I actually think right now, and even the focus of this panel, I think what we are seeing, particularly coming out of Europe, in some of the ways they're thinking about legislation and putting together different areas of responsible business conduct, it is groundbreaking. I mean, it is focusing on changing the way that global business is done, and here's why I say that. As we focus on mandatory due diligence and what that really means, whether it's upstream, downstream, or both, you're talking about many companies who are effectively going to have to gather more information about how their suppliers and their suppliers and their suppliers' suppliers are ultimately doing business, and are they doing business in a way that's consistent with responsible conduct. They're going to have to report publicly, and whether that's how exactly they're going to report is something that also is changing with a new directive coming out of the EU, the CSRD, and so when we talk about global supply chain due diligence, if the EU's activities don't directly impact a regulated company, they are going to have an indirect impact on tens of thousands of additional companies. So either you are directly impacted because you're regulated, or you're indirectly impacted because you are being due diligenced by somebody else who's directly impacted. And so ultimately what we are seeing is a dramatic change in the global landscape of how responsible business conduct is expected to be performed. And the final point I'll make is what this really reminds me of right now at this inflection point is sort of like 2006, 2007 in the context of anti-corruption. Because recall, anti-corruption conventions, the FCPA, these have been in place, for quite some time. It was really 2006, 2007, we started to see real enforcement under the FCPA, and what that led to was the influx of FCPA due diligence and all of the controls around contract terms and training and that whole infrastructure that now exists really came in about 15 years ago from an enforcement lens. And so I think in looking at macro trends and putting these two fields together, it feels to me like we're pretty much at that 2006, 2007 point when anti-corruption became a business imperative. And I think that's really what we're seeing in the human rights and responsible business conduct field as well. Whether I want to see that or not.
Indeed. Anita, this is not exactly the same question for you, but related in terms of international frameworks. You've already mentioned the UNGPs, the OECD guidelines. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about how those could be used in similar circumstances or more broadly in combating corruption.
Well, again, I think we've talked about that, right? Well, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, have different chapters, including human rights, right? So it attempts to take labor, tax, human rights, a broad bunch of responsible business conduct issues, and the OECD actually has a guide that says, actually think about due diligence across that spectrum. How many companies are sort of doing that integrated, consolidated thing, I think, to be seen. So I just want to close by echoing, I think, what John said, which is that, yes, I think we're at an inflection point, but the speed has been faster. That with corruption, we started with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and it took us a while to get to a large multilateral treaty. But for those of you who are sort of newer to this debate, I would say, in addition to what we're seeing in Europe, right, we have, to Irit's point about what about the US or Canada or these other common law countries, civil society is going to continue to press for legislation, but we have requirements in procurement. And of course, many of you may know in the United States, we have under the Tariff Act, right, that if your goods are connected to forced labor, they can be excluded at the border, meaning that you need to do due diligence. So I think the direction of travel it's just there, and it's happened so quickly. And just to say, it is a pipe dream, but there is a negotiation for a binding treaty on business and human rights going on at the Human Rights Council in Geneva. Is that the right place? Is that the right treaty? Doesn't matter. It's just to say that while we're talking about national laws, we're also having a debate which the EU and some European countries are actually now wanting to participate in, right? So this is what's interesting, right, is that the EU is playing in multiple places. And if we look further, the governments have just begun negotiation on a new treaty on plastics, right, which is the next wave. And in that treaty, the whole concept of human rights due diligence and the role of business is going to be very much debated and embedded in the treaty. So I think we're going to see beyond national legislation, when we talk about focused treaties, that this idea of human rights due diligence is going to be there. So it's actually, to some extent, surpassing corruption, right, in terms of the fact that it can be embedded in many things.
Thank you for that. I want to give our audience another shot in case anyone's felt inspired. Yeah, please come up.
Yeah, still Simon Gauss with the Alliance for Integrity. One other topic that I wanted to ask about is, I think implicitly we've mostly been talking about sort of tier one suppliers, direct suppliers, right? And that's where 99% of the current legislation takes place, and there are reasons for this. Partly because, it gets much more complicated if you go, especially maybe not to the end of the supply chain, like the fundamentals, that's often actually simpler, but tier 3, tier 4 suppliers, it's very intransparent. Often companies don't know who they are. The networks are huge, so the same supplier supplies millions of companies in various levels, right? So it's all very complicated. And I guess the question is, where do you see in an ideal world this should go, right? Should we arrive at the point where actually a company is legally responsible for due diligence across the whole supply chain? Or should the responsibility slowly go down? Or what could be a possible answer to this? Thanks.
I see we're all looking at each other, wondering who wants to take it.
I'll start, because again, I'm an academic, so I can, as I said in an earlier panel, I can just make it up. But no, and I think, Irit, I would really be curious to see what you think, and then really hear the corporate perspective, right? Which is that when there has been regulation, right? So if we think about conflict minerals, right? Industry innovates, and again, I think one of the questions we have to ask is who can do it better, right? The private sector can come up with innovative solutions to address these challenges if asked to do so, right? So I think that the question is, can it be done? And so that's where when I try to look for analogies, and to me, I think some of the things that were done around conflict minerals, right, to actually trace and to create alternative sources that were clean, I think was an interesting model. So I think that's the larger question is, can we do that and replicate that, and who better than a business innovating?
Yeah, and I think to add on to that is exactly as you say, I think business will definitely do what they mandated or regulated to do. I think also the question would be, it depends based on the company's supply chain and, and I go back to what's material to the company. So in some instances, the minerals, if you have to prove where everything comes from, then the company's going to make a plan to show. But if it's an ad hoc kind of product that they're using, maybe not. But I think if it's material to their business line or their business model or business strategy, and it's regulated, they'll come up with a solution.
So I'm of two minds here. My first instinct is companies are too big, and that if you can't do the due diligence, maybe you shouldn't be doing the business. So that's my first mind, and I truly believe we've gotten to a point where sectors are highly concentrated, and we have these behemoths out there in the marketplace. That said, we also know that companies know, for the most part, where these risks are, right? If we look at chocolate, we all know what the issues are in the cocoa sector, and they're primarily in 2 countries. And so there are ways, as others have said, for these companies to come together and to innovate and to invest in those small farmers that are frankly bearing the brunt of all these risks, right? And they're not doing it, but they could be doing it. So it's all to say, I think, I do think these kinds of measures will hopefully then get companies to think about how they actually make these supply chains more sustainable, that eliminate a lot of these risks. But also, I do think that we need more actors actually in the system, not less.
Yeah, I'll come in on this one too. So I think, it is doable. I think the bigger the company, the harder it is, because let's say you have 50,000 suppliers, and for the whatever good it is or service you're getting, there are going to be however many multiples of that in terms of sub-suppliers. But the key is going to be risk tiering, and whether that's based on the materiality of the product, whether that's based on the potential human rights risk. I think if there is meaningful and reasonable risk tiering, along with some private sector innovation, I think it becomes doable. I think if you're going to ask big companies to do global due diligence back to the raw material phase on all products and services without any risk tiering, with an equal status of diligence, that becomes a really difficult task. I don't want to say it's impossible, but it's a really difficult task. So I think the key is going to be around risk tiering and prioritization.
Say prioritize.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's consistent with human rights principles and anti-corruption principles in terms of due diligence. And I mean, that's basically how compliance works, is you risk tier and you focus on those areas that are the highest risk. So I think it's doable, consistent with basic compliance principles and the UNGPs.
I hope that was a good answer, at least to the beginning of your question. We are coming up to our last 5 minutes, so what I'd like to do is give each of you a couple of minutes just for final reflections. I saw some of you scribbling notes throughout, so if you wanted to respond to anything that's been said, or simply wrap up and talk a little bit about, what you see as the most important in this crossover of topics. Anita, you're right here, so I'll start with you.
So I think you mentioned this, John, at the beginning, which is one issue we overlook is the last piece, which is remedy and providing remedy to people who've been affected. That this issue, I think, is underexplored by companies, that you may have a compliance-based program in the anti-corruption and space, But in the human rights space, remediating harm to people is just a different thing. And we talk about this cumbersome term of operational level grievance mechanisms, but really that is a place where I think that there really is difference and divergence, and that needs to be explored and thought through carefully.
Yeah, I mean, I think that my final reflection is going to be kind of going back to something we talked about before, which is a little bit around direction of travel. And, as Anita said, the human rights space right now is moving at a blistering pace, and it's moving in two ways, and this is sort of the final point I'll make. You are seeing effectively standalone human rights legislation and regulation, like the mandatory human rights due diligence directives, but at the same time, what you're increasingly seeing is human rights integrated into other areas of international regulatory compliance. And we're talking about corruption today, but it could be money laundering. It can be export controls. It can be trade. And we heard a little bit about trade earlier. Obviously sanctions with global Magnitsky laws. So I think what we are seeing on the human rights side is pushing forward on a number of fronts, standalone and integrated into other areas of international regulatory compliance. And I think in the end, what we're going to end up seeing is programs a lot like Henty's good work at SNC, where it's going to have to be a holistic and integrated approach that looks to tackle these related issues.
And maybe I'll just end on a high note and sort of echo some of the other comments that were made earlier. When I got into human rights work, there wasn't a topic called business and human rights. It didn't even exist. And we've come so far in such a very short period of time. So I'm just very excited about where we're going, because I do agree with the other panelists that the trend here is going in the right direction, where we are seeing more integration of these reporting mechanisms, these regulations, the legislation, but also companies just starting to really recognize that they have to take it on board. And we have conversations with companies every day that are doing human rights due diligence. Not exactly the way we want it yet, but they're getting there. So I'm confident that we are moving in the right way, and that we will have more transparency, and that those of you who are here to fight corruption will be benefited by what's happening in the human rights space, and we are already benefiting from what you all have done in the corruption space.
Can I just say ditto to everybody? But really, I think it's and I'll go back to what I keep on saying. It's up to us, to kind of raise the bar. I think it's up to everybody, especially from a civil society perspective, to hold companies accountable. Because as companies are being held accountable, that kind of lifts the veil of what's going on there, which then makes it easier for other companies to conduct work, because then you know who the different actors are. And from a company perspective, it's never too late to start. And I think the space of anti-corruption, human rights, it's an ideal space for collective action, collaboration, talking with your peers, talking with others, different industries, and just trying to see what's going to work for me in my organization. There's a lot happening already there, and just keep on talking and get started. Thank you.
They cut me off. Thank you. Well, really, it's just to say thank you once again to all of our panelists. I think this was an extremely engaged discussion, a little bit of debate, and I hope that each of you, as our audience, will be able to say that you maybe learned something new today, that you'll take away these ideas, these tools back into the world with you. So in your own capacities, you can use them, use the ideas, and if you want to come talk to us about them as well, please do. We're more than happy to see how we can encourage both sides, human rights and corruption efforts, to be working together and making sure that we're creating a safer space for people everywhere. So thank you so much and have a really good evening. Thanks for staying to the end of our last session of the day.